A Sweet Taste of Cake by The Descendant. Chapter 12. Sugar Cubes. Suffice it to say, there was a wedding. Suffice it to say, there were months of planning, that there were serious questions about appetizers and the colors of tablecloths. Suffice it to say that there was a dress, one made by a studious old dressmaker and her young unicorn apprentice, whose detailing was as exacting and as precise as each one of the 3 diamonds of her cutie mark. Suffice it to say, there was a ceremony. Suffice it to say, there was a tearful reunion of Cupcake's sister with her father, the big stallion even wrapping her mare friend in a mammoth hug. Suffice it to say, there was a ceremony, one of traditional equestrian tastes. Suffice it to say, her nieces threw flower petals. Suffice it to say, there was disappointment that the old dance hall where they had first met had gone out of business and was not available for the reception. Suffice it to say that Ivory used her new contacts to make sure that Ponyfield City Hall was available, and that the colors and buntings of the circular building filled it with color and life. Suffice it to say that a Ponyville that had long kept the secret of the game of this came out in droves when so invited to partake of the celebration. So much so that Quarry had to offer up bounties for more food and drink. Carrot actually made a profit off his own wedding. Suffice it to say, the celebration went far into the night, whereas the nights were becoming chilly as autumn began. It seemed that the entire body of Ponyville crowded into the celebratory space for warmth and fellowship. Suffice it to say, the crowd made it rather difficult, and in fact impossible, for Carrot and Cupcake to make their departure and enjoy their first night together as a married couple. Suffice it to say, they were a tad miffed by that. Suffice it to say that the next morning they were ushered into the train station by their families. After a tearful goodbye and a round of hugs, the bleary couple were ushered in around the Southbourne train. Suffice it to say, as the train rocked them in their seats and the warm light fell in through the windows, she laid her head across his chest. As the fresh air met them, the two were soon asleep. Suffice it to say that the kindly old conductor laid a blanket across the two as they slumbered together in the seat, knowing that it was probably best that he take the ticket there. Suffice it to say that when the crosshead of the cylinder shore off, sending out a loud cascade of steam hissing out into the afternoon, it startled all aboard the train. The newlyweds were no exception, and they rolled from their feet in alarm. Cupcake landed upon her husband, their nap firmly interrupted. Suffice it to say that the train slowly rolled to a stop just short of a small station that sat within the swampy reaches of the warm, wet part of Equestria. Suffice it to say that the ponies of the tiny village were surprised to have a trainload of visitors. The hamlet opened itself to the stranded travelers, and upon learning that Carrot and Cup were on their honeymoon, the entire village came to life. Suffice it to say, there was a large celebration. Exotic dishes of peppers and rice and crawfish were laid out before the guests. Though they were both far from home as they ever been in their lives, the two ponies felt oddly at ease. I'm calling it, this is the same type of ponies that popped up back on Some Pony to Watch Over Me. Suffice it to say, there was a large celebration. Exotic dishes of peppers and my apologies. Suffice it to say that as the spare engine arrived, brought the wounded train up to the station, there were tearful goodbyes and promises of gifts that would be exchanged. Suffice it to say that the promise was kept and would play out in ways not anticipated by any that waved goodbye on the platform of the station that late afternoon. Suffice it to say that when the train finally arrived in Port-au-Prince, the passengers were very much full of the good food and very much tired for their impromptu festivities. Suffice it to say that as the late night closed in around them, the tired forms of Carrot and Cupcake were slowly drawn through the warm, humid streets of the port city. Her head was in his lap as the carriage drew them along the cobblestone streets, as jazz music floated in from the bars and cabarets. Suffice it to say that the steward of the hotel had to gently wake them and tell them that the railroad company had sent word that they were already registered. Suffice it to say Upon being led to their honeymoon bungalow, the two could only gaze at the splendor. They could hear the wind rustling through the palms around it, could hear the ocean and see the starlight reflected off of it. Suffice it to say, as these smells reached them, they lay together in the bed upon the screened-in porch, and soon were asleep, wrapped within the forelegs of each other, and were so denied for a second night the usual comforts that a honeymoon provides. Suffice it to say that Carrot awoke late the following morning to the inevitable position of having a rather famished-looking cupcake staring down over him. And it was not for any meal that she was starved, but for something far more delightful, enticing, and satisfying. With that, he raised his lips to hers. With small kisses, he began to draw them down across her neck, her chest, her barrel. So it was that they spent the first day amid the balmy sea breezes, partaking of such delights as would satiate their appetite for the taste of the other's affections, filled a longing whose satisfaction had been denied them for 2 long nights. The steward had seen this before. Even though they had placed a breakfast order, the food had gone largely uneaten. One day of it had been understandable, but a second only left him fearing for the health of his clientele. Besides, Port-au-Prince had so much to offer a young couple besides the view from the soft beds of the bungalow. They had to eat something. One cannot live on love alone! Clearing his throat, the steward disregarded the do not disturb sign and knocked on the door. As he waited, he looked down to the plates, saw that the waffle had been nibbled on in such a manner it now resembled a heart. He could not also help but notice that the tooth marks upon it were from 2 different ponies, one smaller, one larger. He could not imagine that when the two had met at the apex of the heart, that it had set off another situation that left the breakfast to expire. He waited as long as he thought polite, and then lifted his hoof to knock once more. Almost as he had done so, the door came open just long enough to reveal the form of a rather haggard, yet visibly exalted young stallion with an amber coat. "Hi!" raised Carrot in a euphoric tone. "Good afternoon, sir," said the steward. "I'm very sorry to interrupt, but seeing as your breakfast went uneaten, yeah, we were, occupied," said a blushing Carrot. "Understandable, sir. Seeing as much, on behalf of the hotel, we would like to offer you these meal vouchers for dinner at any of our number of our local eateries," spoke the steward as he produced a handful of coupons from his uniform. "Oh, wow. Thank you," said Carrot as he took them up. "I really appreciate that." The steward smiled. "Dessert snap? What would you think of eating in the city tonight?" called Carrot. "Oh, that would be lovely," came the joyful, lilting voice of the mayor. "Now, come back to bed." The steward saw Carrot blush some more and looked at him with a ridiculous grin. "I would also like to remind, sir, that your beverages are included in the honeymoon package, and that you have not requested any today," said the naughty steward. We have it. Iced tea, please," said Carrot as he turned back within the bungalow. "Sugar plum? Would you like anything to drink?" At the mention of a second name, the steward wondered how many mares the stallion was entertaining. When the same happy voice answered, he realized it was simply another pet name for the same mare who had sang out happily the first time. "Oh, raspberry tea. Now, come back to bed." "Perhaps some ice water too, sir. I shall bring you pitchers of each, sir. We wouldn't want you to both get dehydrated after all," said the steward with a smile. As Carrot blushed some more, the steward went off into the midday sun, the palms rustling around him. As he went down the path, he could not help but smile to himself. They seemed quite happy, that young couple, and why shouldn't they be? They fit together so well, after all. The pitchers were discovered soon after. Carrot prepared a tray with 2 tall glasses of the drinks. let a small mountain of sugar cubes gather in a bowl so they could sweeten their drinks to taste. As he lifted the tray, it brought out back to the hidden ports above the wires, away from any prying eyes. Cupcake swung in the hammock, letting the warm ocean breeze settle over her. Carrot's eyes fell across her once more as it caught in the wild frazzle of her mane. He prepared her drink first. Asked, "How many sugar cubes would you like, honey bun?" "Two, please." She answered as she turned upon the hammock. She regarded him sweetly as he poured the teas and dropped the sugar and ice cubes within the careful hooves. As he did, she hovered upside down upon the hammock, above the tray of drinks. He lifted the glass, and to her surprise, he touched it to her chest, her stomach, her neck. The cold raced through her as the ice within the glass chimed out, making her squirm and give tiny happy squeals each time the glass pressed her coat. Her small sounds rose higher as thin wet films fell over her, as the condensation found its way through the blue hues of her coat and met fair skin underneath. He constantly tormented her until the ice clattered in the bucket, announcing that time had passed. With that, he looked for a place to put it where she could reach it from the hammock. As he did, her hoof lifted and brushed his chest. He looked up to see her gesturing to the already familiar daybed bed across the way. Understanding what she was implying, he took her glass into his across the way and laid them carefully upon the table that stood nearby. Jumping upon the bed, he looked up to realize he had forgotten to flavor his own tea. Carrot put his hoof to his face as he realized his mistake. He looked up to her to see her still upside down upon the hammock. Her hooves laid a rest upon her, folded along the length of her chest. The twin tones of her rosy mane fell from her, hung loose and farther down. Her rear legs crossed at the ankles, lying upon the post and gently moving in a slow motion to make the hammock sway just so. She looked at him with a look of sublime anticipation, an unending stream of expectancy as he moved her hips back and forth in regular motions, making her body lift and sway as she lay supine upon the hammock. "Does her snap?" he asked as he laid his head upon the table to ponder his love in her repose. "When you get up, would you bring me a sugar cube? Or two, please?" Cupcake sat up and looked at him over her shoulder. A devious smile crossed her face, and with that, she leapt from the hammock and gathered the entirety of the sugar cube bowl by the thin wire handle and carried it across the way. Carrot watched as she brushed the back of her mane, and then, as though in slow motion, she lowered her head and picked up one of the cubes with her teeth. She turned and looked at him, the sugar cube resting upon her lips, set upon her teeth. She moved, but not toward the tall glass of iced tea. She lowered her head and made him small moments to claim the cube, pulling back at the slightest each time he reached up. Carrot smiled to her, saw the perfect angles of the sugar cube playing out against the ideal blue of her coat and the white of her teeth. She lowered herself again, this time without teasing him. His lip met hers, moved against hers, sharing the sugar cube back and forth between them. Each tasted across it the tongue of the other until this cube had melted away across their lips. "One cube?" she asked with a giggle, her hoof making a small circle across his chest. Two." "Two? Oh yes, most definitely two!" He watched her lift another one, striking the image of the sugar cube, and its corners juxtaposed against the soft curves of her face. One little corner of the cube sat out, calling his lips to hers once more. Sugar cube, corner. The three little words floated through him as they shared a second cube, the taste of the sugar licking them in one sensation of taste. "I think I just thought of a new name for the bakery," he said as he lowered his head back to the pillow. With that, she climbed back onto the bed with him, laid herself across his chest. "That's so wonderful, Carrot," she said as her eyes closed and he stroked her mane. The sounds of the ocean rolled up the beats as Cupcake completed her thought. "Everything is just so wonderful." They enjoyed their dinner in the city. The restaurant was pleasant and located right in the main square. They were seated in a garden and listened to jazz music that floated over the city as they ate. They walked past the old fortress. The gates were illuminated by lanterns that flashed as though in an explosion of colors. They walked the beach as the sun set. As they watched Celestia lower her charge across the horizon, the night fell. They scampered among the tide, chased the birds, then each other. She looked back to see that he had stopped in his chase, and was staring down at something that stood upon the sand. He raised his head and asked her to return. As she did, she found that his hoofprint was set along one of hers, and encompassed it. Together, the two prints seemed almost as one. He looked up to her. She smiled as she encircled the two prints with a perfect heart. Together, they walked down to where the waters of the ocean came rolling in. Let it wash over their ankles and their legs as the last rays of sunset fell in the west, and they stared over the broad horizon. With that, they went back up to the sheltered bungalow, hidden as it was among the palms, away from the inquisitive eyes and delicate ears of those who might be enjoying a stroll upon the moonlit beach. Good thing that, as the night was still young, and they were very much in love. There is no greater argument for the existence of superpowers than the power of perception granted to mothers. The tiniest whisper when a child is supposed to be asleep. The faintest cry of pain from an upset stomach. These are all within the range of the ears of a caring mother. The ability to sense that something is not right, that their child is somehow in harm, danger, or hurting themselves. The ability to just know. These are gifts given to a mother. The gift lures Roxy awake on a brilliant moonlit night in the days of fading autumn. What she sensed as she slowly left Clyde in a warm bed was a feeling that set upon her maternal instincts. Something she could not name. Something was wrong with one of her babies, but she did not know what. She went down the hallway that separated the two bedrooms on silent hooves, avoiding the familiar weak places that would sound out in winning groans disturbed. The door of the room was already open a crack. Roxy stared within as a nameless apprehension filled her. Her eyes swept the room, saw where the figures of Inky, Blinky, and Maud still slept upon their beds. She found no such comfort upon looking on Pinky's bed. It was empty. The sheets were thrown wide, and no sign of the pink filly anywhere in the room that met her searching eyes. She quickly wheeled around to the upstairs bathroom, saw the door wide and the room unoccupied. Inside a few steps, Roxy was heading down the stairs on quick hooves. The mother moved from room, searching out her missing daughter. As she did, she called her name. Pink? She whispered, her eyes growing more and more accustomed to the darkness as she searched out small places, darting back and forth through rooms she had already checked. Picamina? Now isn't the time for games, she said even as she sped around the rooms, lifting her voice as high as she dared. Picamina? Pinkie Pie? Pinkie? 100 horrors grew inside her as she sped back up the stairs, looked across the 3 rooms that stood there in the darkness once more, and then sped back down the stairs with noises of constrained worry. She was not here. She was not in the house. Pinkie was not in the small, quiet house at all. Worries that only a parent can feel began to rise up in Roxy. Horrible thoughts began to rise as the clock in the hallway began to chime in the early morning hour. She checked each of the downstairs rooms again, looking over the couch, even opening the icebox door and peering within as more and more grew behind her eyes. Pinkie! She called once more, louder than before. Movement. A small little motion crossed her eyes, played out in the edges of her vision. Roxy turned and looked out the window. She stared across the fields of the farm Clyde had built, not believing what she saw there. Immediately, she grabbed at a housecoat that stood upon an old rack, opened the door, and stepped a few steps out into the frigid first hours of an autumn morning where the moon still hung in the sky. A voice reached her. At once, her hoof went to her mouth in surprise and alarm. As she watched, a small horror began to spread over her. Inside of a moment, she had pelted back within the house. She had barely cleared the door when she was aware of movement inside her home. The feel of one of her loved ones awake and moving. Clyde stood at the top of the stairs and peered down to her. He too had come awake, said something wrong. He had heard the fearful sound of her racing about and calling for one of their daughters. Clyde too had seen the empty bed, the icy fear of a parent waking him as he stared down to her, felt the cold autumn frost sneaking in through the door as she looked up to him, an anxiety painted across her face. "Clyde!" she called in a whisper implore, alarm in her voice, raising her hoof to him. At once the stallion was crashing down the stairs, joining her as she made for the door. At once the two were outside. He blinked and tried to force his eyes to adjust to the moonlight. Across wood-stepped acres of farm, some movement caught his eye. A shadow that lifted across the tall spire of the silo, with a small flicker of flame, rose against the black of the night. He looked on as a figure swayed back and forth, leapt and kicked in a scene more like a pagan ritual than a party. A party. That is what happening on his farm. That is what his daughter was doing out of her warm bed. Here, in the first hours of a frosty autumn day that still lingered in the blackness of night. Piggy's voice came crackling and uncertain. It was still her daughter. But it was as though she was thin and drawn. As they approached her, they saw her dancing, or at least attempting to dance. Her voice rang out as she sang, or at least attempted to sing. "Pinkamena?" came her mother's voice, and at once the little filly turned to face them. Her colors went into a stark relief as she turned to the darkness. Her shadow fell from the silo as a small birthday cake, one seen hastily thrown together, set before them alight with a dozen of candles. "Hi, Mama! Hi, Papa!" she said as she trembled and called. "Did you come to celebrate the Silo's birthday too? We never threw the Silo a birthday, and I woke up and said, hey, we never threw the Silo a birthday party. Today could be that day. I mean, maybe it could be today, but I don't know. So I just came because..." "Mikey," her father interrupted to little effect. "I was awake and I saw the Silo, and I thought that I could figure out when we built the Silo that could be his birthday." She continued, unaware of the growing was the word, "Piggy-pa." "And I guess we could have one for the barn, the windmill, the house for two, because we don't want to think that we don't love them and make it tell us that there might be worse than what tells windmill and..." "Piggy!" roared her father, his voice echoing out the silo, drifting down over the deep acres of his farm. Piggy went stark still, her expression dropping. For one of the very few instances in her life, she looked upon him as he glared at her in anger, his face creased, and his ears back beneath the black hat. I just wanted to," she said as she trembled, the candles of the cake tossing in the cold autumn wind that drove upon them. Slowly, her two parents came up to her, stood around her, and blocked the wind from reaching her. "Piggy-pa," he said as he lowered his head to her, his expression stirred and set with concern. "Your mother was terrified. She woke up and you weren't in your bed. She ran through the house calling for you. What have you gotten lost or hurt?" Piggy rolled around and looked up to her mother. I'm sorry, Mama." "Piggy," said her mother, "you should know better. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, dear. It's so very cold. You're trembling." "I am?" asked Piggy, seemingly unaware. The filly looked down at her own legs, saw them shake in the moonlight. I am trembling! I'm cold! I'm cold! She said, starting about in place, quickly blew out the candles upon the cake, and wrapped herself around the leg of her father. With that, went back into the house, in the darkness. Together, the three climbed upon the stairs, the shaky form of Pinky still huddled to them. To their surprise, Inky stood at the top of the stairs. Philly hiding behind the door frame of her room. "Mama? Papa? What's going on?" asked the drowsy Philly, looking upon her sister fretfully. "Nothing, dear," said her mother, planting a kiss on her head as Clyde guided Pinky towards her room. "Go back to bed, my love." Pinky lay between them, the heat of their bodies warming to Philly as she fell back to sleep. Roxy cuddled close to her Philly and husband. She soon returned to her sleep, her maternal superpowers being satiated. For Clyde, though, sleep did not come for a great long while. Now his parental instincts were at the fore, and there was no answer soon in company. Something was wrong, something that her Mark wanted, something that had driven her from her bed and into the frigid night, something he did not know how to provide. Clyde closed his eyes and wondered if there was anything he could do. He sat up, looking across his loved ones until sleep found him. He lowered his head back to the pillow. Outside, the moonlight shone. No voices carried on the wind that drove the autumn leaves across the farm. The ball of thin wafer candy stood upon the table. As was a tradition between them. She selected one and lifted it with her teeth so that it rested slightly across her lips. As the warm, sweet smells of the bakery of Sugar Cube Corner lifted around them, carrot cake and cupcake reenacted the moment of inspiration that had given the bakery its name. Carrot saw the thin, round disc sitting upon her tongue, between her lips. In a long motion he leaned in, held his lips to hers, let the disc melt as they passed it back and forth between them. Together, they shared the taste of the candy just as they had shared a sugar cube that long, long ago dissolved, but whose taste had lingered for these years and decades. Years that were sometimes happy, sometimes sad, sometimes trying. This was just one of the many happy little traditions that accompanied the construction of the annual gingerbread house. She watched it come closer and closer to being complete. It truly now looked like their great work that was so often purchased months in advance, or some years was even bid upon for charity. This year, it had a special purpose. This year was special. This heartwarming, the gingerbread house was meant to symbolize that much more. She turned back to the oven and removed a dozen figures awaiting decoration, the residents of the gingerbread house. She lifted back to Carrot, giggled as he saw the great white dollop of frosting still upon his nose. This year was turning out special indeed. It was the Cupcake's great joy that her nieces and nephew had taken to calling him Uncle Carrot so quickly. They had moved about without question, from looking at him as Aunt Cupcake's friend to Aunt Cupcake's cult friend to family. Their acceptance of Carrot was a complete and total as if he had been part of their lives for 1,000 years. Their acceptance of a gangly stallion as total and whole as only a child can offer. Cupcake helped her oldest niece with wash her hose free of the dough as Carrot helped the cult place trays of cookies within the warm oven. The cult being amazed by the rows of blue flame that sat within. Carrot walked gingerly to avoid the little form of his youngest niece, the one who walked beneath and beside him as though she were a puppy rather than a mature and grown-up filly of 6 long years. "Zipperwell, is that your aunt?" As he smiled at the sight, Cupcake looked out the window, saw how old, cold, deep part of winter had once more arrived. Here, inside the warm bakery, she thought of how almost a year before, she had almost run from this bakery in fear. How she had almost let herself become consumed by dread and apprehension. Her fear was gone. Now the weak-jawed stallion sat in the showcase room with his hooves over his eyes, counting as her nephew and nieces tried to hide among the counters, stands, and racks in a game of hide-and-seek. She wondered what would have happened if Carrot had not tripped down the stairs, if her first instinct had not been to reach for him, to see to his hurts. Would scenes of this have happened? Would they still be dwelling in that dark netherworld of not knowing? If he had not taken a risk, trusted to his love. She took the cookies out of the oven as peals of laughter erupted from the showcase room. Looking within, she saw the gentle hooves of her husband, employed in defending himself from attackers who seemed intent on tickling him. He answering their attacks in kind as they fell over him, slid down his flanks, and pressed against him, renewing their assaults. Cupcake giggled to herself as the winter outside grew deeper and darker. Yet the warmth that flowed from the laughter in the next room drove the thoughts of cold far from her. After the children had decorated their cookies, they had all washed the dishes. Cupcake, don't finish with them, drying them as the four once more returned to the showcase room. Cupcake found herself staring out over the cooling rack as a dozen foals smiled back at her, each wildly colored and overly decorated. The cookies were each a picture of happy children, ones that seemed so very alive. Joyful as Carrot was making her sister's foals. Inside Cupcake something moved. A feeling grew, and with her breath she pondered it, let it swirl around as the winter wind rattled at the window panes. She saw the flash of a vision, saw herself standing over her cradle, singing a lullaby as her husband stood nearby. She went to the doorway and leaned against it as she pondered the scene before her. Carrot was doing a dramatic reading of a cookbook. Her youngest niece sat beneath him, tucked into his lap with her head resting upon his forelegs as he sat, her eldest niece and nephew leaning against his flanks as he read. Carrot lifted his distinctive voice, giving characters like Nutmeg and Baker's Chocolate elaborate backstories, after the do battle with mixing spoons and escape the clutches of evil egg beaters. As a brony, I'm relating to this. I don't know why. I just am relating to seeing small little characters in the background and giving them elaborate backstories. Don't know why I'm doing that. She smiled as he set off his ingredients off on adventures, across scorching ovens and through the wilds of kitchens. Carrot had to find the lost trousers of jelly fillings and frostings, the foals hanging on his every word. Her mind went wide to a number of places, saw boxes of unused diapers, clouds of baby powder. The bakery was doing fine. They weren't going to get rich, but they weren't going to starve by any means. They were happy. They loved one another. There was no reason why they couldn't. Please, she whispered to the magic of Equestria. I'm ready for this. I want this. Her eyes settled back upon Carrot. A smile settled over her as he completed his narrative. All too soon, Ruby Quartzer had arrived. The foals gathered their cookies into their paper bags and said goodbyes. Amid the kisses and hugs, the youngest niece had been reluctant to leave, wrapping herself tightly to her aunt and uncle, only their promise of visits whenever she had finished making her finally relinquish her hold. With that, the bakery went all too quiet again. Far too quiet for Cupcake's liking, for her wish. Carrot stood in the kitchen, wiping down his equipment, whistling as he did so. Carrot? He heard her say, her voice soft and full of questions. He had not heard this tone from her before. It caught his attention and drew him up to his wife. Gingersnap? What's up? Something wrong? No, nothing's wrong, she said, sitting there before him, waiting as he too put aside his task and sat with her upon the warm kitchen floor. She began after taking a breath, looking to his green eyes. I think we should start thinking about having a fall. Okay, he said. Her words barely left her. She startled and looked back to him with puzzlement. Really? She asked. I mean, we should really start thinking about what it... Carrot stuck his tongue to the side of his head, took off his cap and ran his hoof under his chin, and gave an intellectual hum. I just sunk, he said, looking back at her grin. Let's have a fall. Carrot! She said as she stood, looking back at him as though she did not believe he was treating it as the waiting manner it was. I'm serious, please, He lifted his mouth to hers, drew her into another kiss. One that called her back down so that she sat with him again, moved closer to him. He looked at her with a smile still upon his face. At the same time, earnestness sat behind his eyes. Okay? he said as she laid it to his chest. The place where in her world where she sat felt the safest and most secure. I am serious. I was going to ask you what you think about getting started at trying to... Really? She asked, her smile so evident that he could feel it upon her as he sat there pressed against him. Yes, he said as he lowered himself to plant a kiss on her head. Have you asked Magic yet? Yes, she answered. Just as you were playing with... Please. Please. She heard him say it with his voice just above a whisper, firm, resolute. I want this. I'm ready for this. As soon as he had finished, she repeated her earlier implore, nuzzling beneath his chin and against his chest as she spoke the words. It was entirely symbolic, at least the words, but what it meant spoke volumes. This, then, was their wish, that this would happen, that they would have this for one another. So began the second round of the game of this. With that, more strings of causality looped around them, some moving in ways that they, perhaps, had not expected. She lifted herself up and stared up to him. She took deep breaths, her heart skipping as he lowered his nose to hers. As the two rubbed them together in slow, long circles and figure eights, the sensation of their touch fell through one another, filling the other with well-being, love, hope. Then we should get started? She said as a giggle lifted through her. Karen's eyes shifted back and forth, pondering his kitchen with a wicked smile. You mean, right here? He said as he looked back to her with a wink. Cupcake put her hoof to his chest, rolled her eyes, and then stood. Oh, Carrot, she said while she turned toward the showcase room, looking back at him over her shoulder. You're insatiable! He met her rosy eyes and gave a small smile. Only because you're so beautiful, Sugar Plum. He followed her as she began to walk, watched her steps becoming bouncing ones that revealed her own anticipation. How about here? He asked, pointing out a long displayed case. He listened to her giggle, felt himself lifting the music of it. How about here? He inquired, pointing out the seldom-used closet by the door. Her laughter growing with each succession. Here, he implored as their host made soft sounds across each of the steps that led to the second floor and the bedroom beyond. Her laughter stopped as they reached the top of the stairs. She felt his hoof trace the length of her stifle and gasket. She looked back and saw him draw himself up, ask her to return his embrace. As he did, she felt him lift her, carrying in an unpony-like fancy. He used his body to open the door, let his frame fall back and close it gently. With that, he laid his wife, his love, upon the bed and looked over her body. Wherever you want to go, he repeated as a memory reached him, I'll go there with you. As the winter wind swirled around the bakery, the place where they both wished to go was towards making their love manifest, bringing to this happy world of magic, sunlit days that a little pony could cherish. She called his body over hers, guiding his face down to hers. And with that, they went as one down that path. Ladies and gentlemen, this may have been the most sensual chapter I have ever read of any fanfic. I promise you, barring any new lemons I may find, I will never read something like this again. I promise. Okay, that's a bloody lie.